the centennial of the First World War, the 100th anniversary of all these events, has in many ways played out exactly as many scholars, including myself, have feared. People are using this for their own purposes, whether those purposes are scholarly, historical, or political, and they're doing so without really delving deeply into what actually happened. Many of these ideas are consistent instead with old understandings or tired tropes. I know I'm getting sick already of hearing about poetry and Christmas truces. Or they are relying on overly simple explanations of what is, as Max said, one of the most complex events in human history. 100 years is a good time for everyone to come at this war anew. And it's not just because of the nice, neat, round number of the anniversary. And I know scholars like myself are equally fearful that next year people will have just forgotten this event because it no longer has a 100th anniversary. That, to me, would be a great mistake. What we have, however, with 100 years' time past us are scholars today with no memory of the event, no living memory of the event. We know a little bit more about how the story ends, or at least we think we do. And we have new archives and new scholarly methodologies with which we can approach the subject, and John and Kate can certainly speak to that better than I can. A little bit of this ignorance of the First World War, I must confess, is our own fault as scholars. We have left a black hole in this period in American history, especially American history. And part of this is the lack of professors at PhD granting institutions who specialize in World War I over the past few decades. My daughter's teacher, in fact, my 8th grade daughter's teacher, even introduced the First World War to her class by telling them, "I'll bet you all can go home and talk to your parents and none of them will know anything about this event." My daughter was smart enough to keep her mouth shut and her hand down. And you can also do this by taking a very short walk from this building and look at the Second World War memorial that this country built, and then go into the woods and look at the very small Washington, D.C. memorial that this country built. As a result, Americans lack a deep understanding of this period, and I know that FPRI has worked very hard to correct this, but we have a long, long way to go, I'm afraid. This gap would be just a small tragedy were it not for what is at stake and the way that people are using 1914 to inform policy today. So what I'd like to do here quickly, in about 15-20 minutes, is to discuss two main points to A, ground us in what actually happened in 1914, and B, to set up a discussion afterwards. It seems to me axiomatic that if we're going to make any sense or any use out of 1914 at all, we have to know what actually happened. And that means knowing the actual facts of history so that we can then begin to think about analogies and lessons of this time in history. And it's not been said by people far wiser than me. The past is a foreign country and the past is a complicated place. We cannot reduce it to its simplicities, however tempting that might be. 1914 might be, as I try to convince my students, the single most complicated period in human history, far more complicated in many ways than the age in which we're working with today. That, of course, only makes explaining this time all that much harder to do. So I'd like to focus really on 2 points, and Mac hit one of them already, and that is the trade-off or the balance between explaining the outbreak of this war by structural forces and explaining them by contingent forces. And very loosely put, structural explanations are larger than human beings. They are the kinds of things that Margaret Macmillan and Christopher Clark and others have tried to argue, John Mearsheimer, another one, to argue that when powers are rising and powers are falling, that this creates an unstable world. So the argument that folks have been putting out lately is that China is like Germany of 1914. To quote John Mearsheimer, it is a state that has excess power that it sooner or later will use. In this analogy, most often, the United States plays the role of Great Britain, a declining empire, no longer able to play the role of balancer. And the argument here is that crises come when great power competition rises. Now, I'll talk a little bit here in the Q&A of why I think there are some real problems with this. I think the Chinese are basically right when they say we are not the Germany of 1914. That is, the culture is different, the place is different, the ideas are different. But it's not the only structural explanation that has come about. Other historians have argued that periods of great crisis like 1914 happen when the power of tradition comes under fire from the power of modernity, the same kinds of arguments being used to explain the Arab Spring today. In the 1914 case, the tradition is monarchy coming under fire from democracy or coming under fire from socialism or pick your modernity. On the surface, these explanations are alluring precisely for the reasons that Mac articulated. They seem to offer an explanation. That is to say, if you can identify what the structures are, and if you can find similar structures at work, then theoretically you ought to be able to predict what's going to happen. In other words, the theory becomes both powerful and predictive. Or so they might seem. But we need to be really, really careful here. In fact, structural causes, I would argue, are not as important as they might seem on the surface. Great power relations from the time of the second Morocco crisis, the Agadir crisis that Mac mentioned, it's almost like we coordinated these talks, but great power relations since that crisis had actually been improving. And if you take a look at what was actually going on in the summer of 1914, the First World War is so shocking to Europeans precisely because they never saw it coming. At the exact moment that Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo almost 100 years ago to the month right now, to the day right now, the British and German navies were not planning how to sink one another. They were, in fact, getting riotously drunk together at Fleet Week ceremonies at Kiel. And even after the hangovers passed and everybody knew what had happened, the British Navy was still planning to invite the German Navy to Portsmouth in order to return the favor. In France, French President Raymond Poincaré dined at the German embassy in Paris, the first French president to do so since 1870. And this act was seen by most people on both sides of the Rhine as a very important step towards creating an alliance, not an alliance, creating an entente or an agreement over the Rhine River, similar to the one that had recently occurred over the English Channel. And French observers especially noted that the ancient hatreds between Britain and France, were much more long-standing than those between France and Germany, yet those between Britain and France had been overcome. Businessmen and socialists alike talked of the importance of big business. Mac talked about Norman Angell, one of the key people making this argument, that business would create links over the Rhine River between France and Britain, who were, after all, tremendous trading partners, and that these links might become more important in forging peace between them than anything the diplomats could have done. So, if it wasn't structural, or not only structural, then what was it? And Mac used the phrase that I had emailed to him, that it was a perfect storm of events. I think the importance of the July crisis of 1914, and remember please that we call it the July crisis, not the June crisis, meaning that it's not actually the assassination of the Archduke that is the key event here. This crisis is different from the ones that had come before. It's different from the two Morocco crises that Mac mentioned. It's different from the Fashoda crisis of 1898, a crisis between France and Britain. This one's different for a couple of reasons, and I think it's worth spending a little bit of time to play them out. One reason this crisis is different, and John may have some things to say on this, is that Austria-Hungary, for the first time in a very long time, can depict itself as the victim of Balkan politics rather than as the aggressor. In other words, it was an archduke. It was an act of what we would call an act of state-sponsored terrorism that had been committed. That means that Austria-Hungary would have the right, diplomatic freedom, diplomatic maneuver, to demand something of Serbia. Moreover, the Austro-Hungarians assumed, because not even the Russians could support regicide as a way of changing governments, Russia might be slow to act. And again, Britain and France, not involved in this crisis at all, what newspapers even into August 1914 were still calling the Austro-Serb crisis, Britain and France might well stay out. For the Germans, this crisis seemed to offer an opportunity to win big without having to do very much. If they challenged the Russians and the Russians backed down, they would win without having to do very much at all. If, on the other hand, Russia did mobilize, as Russia did, Germany could do exactly what the German government did. It could defend its actions as defensive actions, not as offensive actions. And in that regard, they would have the support of the German people behind them. The problem with all of this is that this crisis did not fit the mold that anyone was ready to handle. And as is well known today, when Kaiser Wilhelm told his chief of staff, Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, to prepare for a war against Russia only, Moltke famously told him that he couldn't do it. To which the Kaiser responded, "Your uncle would have given me a better answer." This is another reason why the war got out of control as quickly as it did. It wasn't the war they had planned for. And because of the way that this war began, each state, even the Germans, could claim their actions as defensive and thus just. The second point that I want to articulate here is so obvious that we often overlook it. The origins of this war were not on the Rhine River. They were not in the North Sea. They were on the Danube, at least the origins of the July crisis. This is a Balkan crisis. It is a war that most people expected to be a third Balkan war, not a first world war. In this sense, I think it's important to understand, the great powers were not acting, they were reacting. And I think this is especially the case in France. They were not consciously trying to balance here. Britain may be the only exception to this, and I'll let Kate get into that if she wants to. But the great powers got a very different crisis from the one that they were expecting. What they thought was going to happen was either a third Balkan war or a long, drawn-out diplomatic crisis like the Morocco crises that Mac articulated. Those crises, it's important to understand, both Morocco crises and the Fashoda crisis, the three big diplomatic crises from 1898 to 1911, all three of those crises ended peacefully. And all three of them took a very, very long time to play out. That's what people were expecting in 1914. In the case of the Fashoda crisis, which is between Britain and France for control over what is now Sudan, the headwaters, what they thought were the headwaters of the Nile River, that crisis resulted not in war between Britain and France, but in the signing of an entente between Britain and France. In other words, these crises need not produce war, and they could, in fact, produce a better state than they had going in. This is why, I think, the war went so total so quickly and over so small a proximate cause. It's also, I think, why people became so quickly disoriented by it, and why so many of the regimes that looked pretty solid in 1914 did not survive to 1918. And again, Mac alluded to this. The Ottoman, Russian, I would add the German. Who am I missing? Ottoman, Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian, thank you. Just bought a book at Kramer Books on this, and I got right out of my mind. I was just reading this on the metro coming over. And it's also, I think, why the structural methods don't hold as much water as the contingent methods. We can't know for sure, but it seems to me possible that had Gavrilo Princip not stopped for a sandwich, or had Franz Ferdinand's driver known how to get that car in reverse without stalling it, Europe might well have had years of peace ahead of it. The way I read the environment of 1914, again, this is less diplomatic than it is social, there were plenty of signs pointing in the direction of less, not more, conflict. And in this regard, it seems to me, it's different from the age that we're living in now, where most observers see the environment as pessimistic. In 1914, at least before July 23rd, 1914, most people saw things as getting better. They were optimistic. If no World War I, I think Mac's entirely right. There's no World War II, there's no Holocaust, there's no Cold War, there's no fascism. Or at least they don't play out the way that they did. So, out of all of this, what lessons might we be able to draw? Well, the first is, and I think hopefully I made this clear, we need to be very careful of analogies that seek to provide very simple solutions. The world that we're living in today is like 1914 in some ways. It is very much unlike 1914 in other ways. So for me, at least, the simple analogies that folks have drawn, and it's not just Mearsheimer, Macmillan, and Clark, it is people who have taken their arguments and oversimplified them. We need to be very, very careful. Differences, it seems to me, are as important as similarities, and here's the point that Mac was making about China and Germany, China 2014 and Germany 1914. They are culturally different. They are politically different. Their histories are different. The key, then, is not to try to fit evidence to a theory, but to try to use the past analytically, to try to see where the history does or does not support the theory. In my view, at any rate, history is not so much about right and wrong as it is trying to figure out where the theory helps you see patterns better. What I tell my students, it's like going to the eye doctor when they flip the lenses in front of you. Is it better or worse if you do this? Right? And history is not necessarily predictive. It doesn't tend to work in the way that we would like it to work. If case A looks like case B, it doesn't necessarily produce the same effect. This is obviously difficult to do. Also, it seems to me, we need to think about the war in the widest possible context that we can. These are not just nation states going to war. They are, of course, global empires going to war. Another way to think about this, I think, and this is where I want to kind of finish up, is to think about the place of the First World War in the wider span of history in which we're trying to think about here. Calling the First World War, or dating the First World War, 1914 to 1918, privileges a certain view of the war. It privileges a French, British, German view of the war. As I'm sure John can tell you, if you go to the Balkans, more often than not, the war is 1911 to 1921, 22, 23. There are plenty of historians, and I tend to think myself increasingly thinking this way. It makes sense to think of the two world wars as one grand conflict, a second 30 Years' War, 1914 to 1945. And I say that as Captain Harry Truman is looking at me here from the painting, and Harry Truman is a nice symbol of that. A citizen soldier, captain of artillery in 1914. In 1945, he goes to Potsdam, Germany, trying consciously in his own mind to solve the problems that Woodrow Wilson failed to solve. In Truman's own mind, they are the same issues. What will be the place of Germany in the new Europe? What will be the place of Russia in the new Europe? Where will ethnic and political boundaries match up? What should the United States do about it? How should the economy of the world be reoriented? And how tightly should the nations of the world be connected through some sort of international organization or set of organizations? It's the same set of problems. And not by coincidence, Harry Truman asked to be sworn in as President of the United States underneath the portrait of Woodrow Wilson. So, if, and here's what I want to finish up, as FPRI's motto tells us, a nation must think before it acts, It has to know what it's thinking about. And critically, it has to get its history right. Thank you.